Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Okay, the recording is in progress. Well, good morning, classmates. It is great to be here with you today. My name is Kyle. You do not already know me, and I am a graduate student at Regent University in Virginia. I also work for a thesis team in Boston, Massachusetts. If you are like me, when I first got started, the topic of crisis was unnerving. And I mean, crisis, right? I mean, being a counselor, you didn't necessarily sign up for these. How do you even prepare for a crisis? That was what I wondered. And now today we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about some guidance I've learned over the years. And I'm going to introduce a 6-step method that I came up with to contextualize safety planning, which I'm going to argue is actually at the heart of clinical crisis response as a natural outgrowth of it, rather than some foreign body we're imposing onto it. And hopefully that's something that you can use or at least know about for your own clinical practice. Now, doing a Google search, here are some pictures of crisis. What do these pictures make you think of? Oh, I'd love for this to be interactive. So please feel free to turn your mics on, and you're going to help me out a lot if you just feel free to voice up and share.
Knocking over the equilibrium.
I love that.
Yeah, I was going to just say it's something starts a chain reaction that then leads to other reactions.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
I thought of spike proteins and COVID.
You just look up crisis. I didn't look up COVID, and these are the pictures that came, and absolutely creating a chain reaction. What does this make you think of? I just love this illustration.
The incredible need for people standing in line for mental health.
Yes. Not there isn't a need for the line. I wish there wasn't a line, but there is a need for the mental health care. Yeah.
I was going to say connectivity from watches to phones to two people sitting on the chairs.
That's great.
I'm with you, Sharni. I think it's a line for mental health.
Yeah. Here's the next one. Here's the next one. And I wonder if at this point in the semester you can relate to either of these images.
Wholeheartedly.
More coffee.
Fatigue and burnout and stress. And I love this. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I love the little squiggles above the left picture. Wonder what is going on in her head. Crisis can be a buzzword, but at its heart, it's very personal. You see on the left this image of the game of life, and all of the big steps that young people take in life. And you see a very optimistic perspective on crisis on the right, which sees it as a crossroads for opportunity. Today I'm gonna be focusing a little bit on youth, and that's and by as a byproduct of that, I'm going to be thinking about like family context as well, and families as a resource in the process of safety planning. Now, in terms of the essence of a crisis, there are 3 components, as one person would put it: the event, a perception, and a failure of the client's typical coping methods. What stands out to you there?
Perception.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the failure part of this, because many times, I mean, we're all in crisis, but it's the failure part of the crisis that is where I think everything begins to fall apart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you imagine two people going through the same circumstances and one person is really struggling and the other person isn't. And the difference might not be, so the difference isn't the events, but the difference might be one of the latter two, the perception or the failure of how things the person's normally survived and gotten by. And I think that latter category is what you see in this second definition, right? A crisis occurs when within persons when their usual problem solving activities are ineffective, allowing the stress of unmet needs to rise. Now, this presentation also has a context to it, and that context is in the state of Massachusetts, crises happen, but safety planning is underutilized. And actually, the hospital system can tend to be very conservative and in some ways triage more people inpatient than is strictly necessary. And what that might feel like on the receiving end is coercion and power dynamics, where you see security and police, where you see involuntary processes, where you see institutions that have the ability to change your life. And a big term that I think is so important for providers is this idea of iatrogenic harm. Is that a term you're familiar with?
Could you say it again? Oh no.
It's right at the it's the last bullet point, iatrogenic harm.
Not familiar with it.
I've never
So-
heard that word.
So it's I believe Greek Genesis is the second half of the word and iatra something is the first half of the word, but this is harm that is actually created from a healer. So that's like healer, Genesis, harm. I think that those three ideas are kind of mixed into this. So the definition we have here is any intervention, regardless of provider intention, which introduces a risk of harm that would not otherwise be present. So that is something that I want you to hold in your minds, because that is the context for this presentation on safety planning. Now, from a counselor's point of view, safety planning is obvious why we do it. We do it because risk is part of life. Treatment may increase risk. You start trauma treatment with someone and all of a sudden they are feeling very fragile and vulnerable, at least as they're getting started in treatment. And there is a need to hold risk, but you are not babysitting a client. And so you have to plan for the times where you're not directly involved. So these are tools that we use. Now, from the client's point of view, safety planning is something different. Really, safety planning is something that helps a person to navigate a crisis. It's something that tends to, it should activate a higher level of functioning, healthcare decision-making, this shift from felt powerlessness to empowerment, reactivity to responsiveness. It's something that should feel empowering from the client's point of view. Now, with this in mind, I'm going to give you a definition for a safety plan. A safety plan is developed through the client's or family's eyes for their benefit and in accordance with their own strengths, resources, and perceptions of what they reasonably think might work now. Now, that might not be how you've thought of a safety plan before, it may or may not, but what stands out to you in that definition?
I like the strengths and resources.
Mm-hmm.
I like through the client's or family's eyes, because perception of
Mhm.
safety would be through their eyes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I would agree with that. I think that's what's so interesting about safety plans is it doesn't really matter what the counselor thinks.
Hmm.
It really matters what the client thinks.
Yeah, absolutely. I've broken this out actually, line by line. And a lot of the things you mentioned stand out to me. clients and families' eyes, so their perspective for their benefits, strengths, resources, perceptions. And this idea of what might work now is also important, because what worked last year might not work this year, and what works this year might not work next year or even tomorrow. And so there's a very now focus on resolving crisis and developing an appropriate safety plan. Now, sometimes we've been a little bit truncated in the way that we've thought about safety plans. And specifically thinking about children and adolescents here, I think that a broader way of understanding safety plans is to attach them to risk behaviors. And the CANS, which is one of the assessment tools that's used in Massachusetts, has 12 categories here and different rating scales for those categories, which I think can clue us into when a safety plan is a useful thing for a provider to engage in. And so not just suicide risk or self-injurious behaviors, although yes, you should safety plan in those situations, but also, I mean, in the case of fire setting or bullying or even exploitation. Now I'm curious, has anyone done safety planning in the context of their work?
Yes, I have with suicidal risks and
Mhm.
self-injurious behaviors, because we deal with that often in addictions.
Mhm. Mhm.
Too many times to count, Kyle,
Okay.
sadly.
Yeah. It is sad. It is sad.
Yeah, me too. I'm prompted to think about when I see recklessness, and that spurs up some need to rethink safety planning, but certainly as it relates to suicide.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, no, thanks for all of that. So I want you to hold these ideas in your head, because we're a lot broader now. We've kind of opened Pandora's box to any and every crisis, many types of risks, and that is where what I'm proposing comes into place. A 6-step process, which is really a crisis response, which naturally flows into a safety plan. So this is not a 6-step process for creating a document. This is 6 steps for responding to someone in crisis to help them come up with a plan, a success plan, a safety plan to help them. Now we're going to start actually in the upper left quadrant, join, and go all the way around clockwise, to in process. So join, identify, relieve, empower, focus, and in process. Now that's going to be the remainder of our time together. Is we're going to talk about this 6-step process, which is really what I've learned to use myself in the everyday of doing crisis counseling, but I think can be broadly applicable to those in outpatient and those in school counseling as well. There's nothing specific to the job that I have that makes it any easier. And I think in some ways actually it makes it harder, because we start with this process of joining. And I want you to think about these first questions for your own practice: how to join with a client. So initial contact, rapport building, safe environments. What do you do? How do you do this first process of meeting and joining with a client?
I think just hearing their story, beginning to hear, what it is that initially brought them to the office. So just starting to hear their story and listen.
Mm-hmm.
I often do mutual, like a mutual introduction. So icebreaker, introduce myself maybe a little bit, then have them introduce themselves.
Mm-hmm.
To number one, to learn about them, but also to build rapport.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, same with the both Robs. I usually have a little background information like an intake when we, so I've already read through that, at least have an idea of what's maybe going on that brought them in. And so I think when the client knows that you've done a little bit of homework beforehand, that you've actually, you know, read all the material that they wrote, I think that helps too. So it's kind of a good jumping off point.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now I don't want you to answer it, but I would just want you to imagine, right? Because this is the job of a crisis counselor, that you have to build an alliance and work towards a crisis resolving safety strategy in one session. So you have one session to do everything that's possible. And, you know, if you have to have that kind of focus, I wonder if your strategy would change in building a therapeutic alliance. I just want you to think about that, because that is, in some ways, the sort of laser focus that you need when you are identifying, right? So getting to the essence of the distress. Now, one phrase that you might hear in the literature is this idea of true north, aligning with true north. This idea that in order to get on the same road as your client, and in order to point them in a helpful direction to find that, you really do have to understand where they are, and you have to get there. I think that that's a big part of the job of joining in crisis counseling is empathy. You have to understand their experience and understand the nature of what their distress is. And I would say that it's not fundamentally about a problem. I mean, you can look through the lens of diagnosis to say, okay, well, the essence of depression is a neurochemical imbalance. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, I mean, the nature of somebody that is feeling depressed is that they feel isolated and they feel angsty and alone, and there's an inner restlessness that is met with just an inability to arouse enough energy to keep going in the day. And there's something that's perhaps they don't have anybody else that is joining with them at that deep level of experience. I mean, one of the things that I've thought about working with homeless clients is a lot of times I'm not going to actually find them a shelter bed. And so a lot of the facts of the situation don't change. If you can't change the facts, can there be a resolution? And I wonder what you think about that. Put yourself in the perspective of a person who is homeless. Maybe part of their distress is that they are just tired and somebody insulted them while they were laying on a park bench, and they are despairing. You can't find them a shelter bed, but do you feel like you can bring them relief? What do you think?
I hear your word relief, and there's a part of me that wrestles with what does that word mean for them in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think there's something human about connecting with another person, even if you can't, you know, I think I had to let go of solving people's problems a long time ago.
Yeah.
Because it feels insurmountable, right? I can't. So I think there's this, I don't know, humanness about connecting with someone regardless of their circumstances that help them to maybe feel like, you know, that they're not alone in this, that there is another person on this earth that cares, that I genuinely understand your situation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of where my mind went.
I know. I think both of those thoughts are great. And I'm going to move on for time to this idea that counselors actually can bring relief. And in fact, some of the things that define a crisis, we see these not in binary terms, but on a spectrum, right? So symptoms, it's not like you have them or you don't. I mean, anxiety itself is common to humanity, and it's just the severity of it that creates what would be called a disorder. And it's the same with everything. So there's some of these things that are on a spectrum. So sometimes resolution is not that everything is settled, everything is final. It's sometimes really about diminishing risk or angst or increasing hope, bringing people to a higher level of functioning, and leaning on some of these basic counseling skills that we learned in Counseling 101. So when I look at these, I'm curious, do you use any of these strategies in what you do in outpatient or?
Mhm.
Definitely.
Mhm. I'm curious, if you found somebody on the brink of crisis, where are you inclined to go, just in terms of your approach as a counselor?
I really go to the active listening.
Mhm.
Mhm. It's amazing what something so profoundly simple can do for helping a person to feel understood and to get a relief from that. Now I mixed the slides up a little bit to get to this one, but I want to go to this notion of empowerment. Now, one of the things that especially in children and adolescents that we talk about locally is this idea of wraparound principles. So this idea of a wellness orientation, of recovering to the norm of movement away from institutionalization to really empowering the family. And that's one of the words that comes to mind for me when I look at this list is empowerment. And one of the things that I tend to use from this list the most is this idea of strengths-based treatment planning. So a strength, let me tell you a story briefly. So there was an 11-year-old that I was working with who was failing his classes. I don't know if he actually was getting Fs, but I mean, he was at risk of staying back a year. And he was also um, just really down on himself. He hated himself about it. He was disrupting the classroom. He was just really dysregulated. And so when he came into our space, he was I mean, borderline comatose. He was like not even making eye contact. He had his arms crossed. And throughout the conversation with him and his dad, I learned that he had an unfinished bike project in the garage. And actually the garage was a little messy, so they let the project just kind of sit there for a few months. And the idea of him going and uh working on the project, finishing it up so we can go for a ride in the park on Saturday was the most exciting thing in the world to him. And it really turned around the whole experience. And it makes me wonder what a strength is. I think that we want to take a strengths-based approach, but the idea the idea of what a strength is, I mean, it really requires you to get to know the person, get to know them deep enough to understand what it is that is helpful to them. And the other side of cans, and if this is a tool that you're familiar with, that's great. If it's not, then I'd encourage you to look into it. They have strengths as pretty integral to their system of treatment planning. And I put little asterisks next to these three because these are the ones that actually, based on the research, are their three most the evidence-based strengths in terms of positive outcomes when utilizing them in treatment. So I would say that the talents and interests would be highlighted in that story that I used with the kid and the bicycle. Now, one thing I found, and I'm sorry I'm having to breeze through this for the sake of time, but one thing I found is that crisis plans can't do everything, and they shouldn't do everything. You try to do too much, and all of a sudden you have something that is cumbersome and it's not useful. And so maybe it's good to focus on just one thing that feels manageable today. And if there's enough consensus built around that one thing, well, we just got through today and we can work on what we need to tomorrow. And so these are some of the most common areas of focus on the left side. I'm going to breeze right through just to this. Oh, well, before I get to the last slide, to this, I would submit to you that a simple plan that doesn't resolve everything is better than a phony plan that tries to do too much. I think a template that you might get from your outpatient kind of shared file box, that's probably not going to be authentic to the nature of the distress, to the essence of the moment. And so it's more important, I think, to find something that works now that speaks to the actual client. So I want you to take this last point seriously, right? So it diminishes the authority of the plan to have actions that a child or someone else is unlikely to take. So you have to work with the person. Now this idea of in process is actually what I'm going to leave you with. And it's this idea that when you create a safety plan, in some ways you're creating a touchstone. You're creating a future conversation, and that future conversation might be 6 hours out. It might be 24 hours out, 3 days out. It might be the next week. It depends on how urgent the situation is. But you are creating a touchstone to come back to. And so it's important to do less, to make it realistic, to use active voice, to speak through the experience of the person, and to make it collaborative, to not come from a point of authority, but to come from a place of collaboration. Now, this is what I introduced. This is my process. I'm not saying it's the only process or even the process that's going to fit in every context for every person, but it's been really useful to me. And so I'm going to invite, I think we might have 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes. I'm going to invite you to look at this, think about what we talked about, and yeah, consider what you could take away for your own practice from these steps.
I think I like the in process in that it is, there's an end goal, but then there's also, you mentioned the idea of kind of wrapping things up and continually coming back to it.
Yeah. Yep.
I like your wraparound principles. I think I like acronyms anyways. So it's something that's easy to apply right within a session. Or in the setting of crises.
I have a client who lot of trauma, so really written a lot of safety plans with her in particular. And I always wonder, after a while, you're like, is this really helping? Like, it feels kind of silly to repeat this every time. But she told me once that she's a rule follower. And so every time we put a safety plan in place for her, she feels like she has to follow the rules and follow the plan. So it helps her to know that, oh, I've got to do what we talked about from a collaborative space. And so I was thinking about this whole time as you were talking about each of these points, that honestly, that whole conceptualization of it fits into each of these categories too.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate each of your comments. We're coming to the end, and so what I'll leave us with is an invitation, if you do have any questions, to email me later. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and really help me grow through this as well. It's fun to present ideas, and thanks so much for yeah, giving it your full attention. So thanks.
Thank you. Can you go back to your first slide so we can look at the title again?